My name's Jack, and I'm going to tell you the story of how my dad took away our childhood and locked us into a nightmare that stretched on for years. It all began when I was 10, and my little sister, Emily, was just 8. We were a regular family, living a peaceful life in a quiet suburb in Ohio. Mom worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and Dad was an engineer for a big defense company. Looking back, I can see now that his job might have had something to do with the growing fear that slowly took over his mind. Things started to change after Mom died. It happened out of nowhere. She got into a car crash on her way home from a night shift. Dad was crushed. We all were. But while Emily and I let our grief show, Dad withdrew into himself. He spent more and more time down in the basement, only coming up for meals or to head off to work. When he was around us, he seemed distant, muttering to himself and scribbling down notes in a little notebook he carried everywhere. About a month after the funeral, Dad called us together for a family meeting. There was something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. This wild, almost feverish look that sent a chill down my spine. "Kids," he said, his voice shaking with excitement he couldn't quite hide. "I've been working on something. Something that'll keep us safe." Emily and I exchanged a confused look. Safe from what? Dad didn't wait for an answer. The world's a dangerous place. There are things out there that most people don't even know about. But I've seen the signs. I know what's coming. He went on to explain in disturbing detail how a nuclear war was on the horizon. He talked about radiation, fallout, and society breaking down. The more he spoke, the more frantic he got, and I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach, like a stone that wouldn't go away. "But don't worry," he said, his face twisting into a grin that didn't feel right. "Daddy's gonna take care of you. I've built us a shelter. We'll be safe there when the bombs drop." That night, Dad showed us the shelter he'd put together in secret. The basement had been completely transformed. What used to be a cluttered, dusty storage room was now a fortified bunker. Thick concrete lined the walls, and a massive, vault-like door had been installed at the entrance. Inside, the place was stocked with canned food, water barrels, medical supplies, and enough survival gear to last for months. Dad was practically glowing with pride as he showed us around, pointing out all the safety features he'd added. But the more I looked around, the more unsettled I felt. This wasn't just a basement. This wasn't normal. The next few weeks went by in a strange kind of routine. Dad still went to work, and Emily and I still went to school, but every evening we had to go down to the shelter for what he called drills. We practiced sealing the door, wearing gas masks, and rationing food. Dad quizzed us nonstop about radiation safety and what to do in case of different emergency situations. Felt more like a training camp than family time. Then came the night everything changed. I woke up to the deafening sound of air raid sirens, my heart racing with fear. Disoriented, I scrambled out of bed, only to find Dad already standing in my room, shaking me awake with a look of sheer panic in his eyes. "It's happening!" he shouted, his voice strained with urgency. "We've got to get to the shelter now." He grabbed my arm and pulled me down the hallway, where we found Emily standing in the doorway of her room, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her stuffed bunny. Dad hurried us both down the stairs and into the basement. The shelter door was wide open, glowing eerily in the red light of the emergency lights that flickered above. "Quick, get inside," Dad urged, pushing us toward the door. "We don't have much time." As soon as we were in, he slammed the heavy door shut behind us. The loud clanking of the locks snapping into place echoed through the room, sending a chill down my spine. The sirens had softened, but I could still hear them faintly through the thick concrete walls. "It's okay," Dad said, pulling us into a tight hug. "We're safe now. Everything's going to be fine." But I knew it wasn't. Nothing would ever be fine again. Hours crawled by, and eventually the sirens stopped. We sat there in the dim light, huddled on one of the cramped bunk beds Dad had installed. He kept checking his watch and a Geiger counter he'd mounted on the wall, muttering about radiation levels and fallout. I tried to close my eyes, but the fear kept me awake. Days turned into weeks, and still Dad wouldn't let us leave the shelter. He kept saying it wasn't safe outside, that the radiation would kill us in minutes. Emily and I begged to go out to see what had happened, to check on our friends, our neighbors. But Dad always shook his head and said the same thing. "There's nothing out there," he'd say, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Everyone's gone. We're the lucky ones. We survived." At first, we believed him. We were just kids and we trusted him. He was our father. Why would he lie to us? But as the days stretched on, something started to feel off. The shelter's small TV and radio only picked up static, which Dad said was because of the EMP from the nuclear blasts. But sometimes, when he thought we were asleep, I'd catch him messing with the dials, looking frustrated and confused. It didn't add up. We fell into a dull routine. Dad started homeschooling us with old textbooks he'd stockpiled before the world changed. We exercised in the small space to stay in shape. Food was rationed carefully, and Dad was always reminding us that we might be stuck down there for years. But the hardest part was the isolation. The shelter felt more like a prison with each passing day. The air was thick and stale, never fresh. The artificial lights above gave me constant headaches. And the silence, oh, the silence was overwhelming. The only sounds were the hum of the air filtration system and the occasional whisper of our voices. Emily had the hardest time of all. She was only 8 when we first went into the shelter, and as the months went by, I saw her spirit slowly fade. She stopped playing with her dolls, stopped laughing at my silly jokes. Instead, she would sit for hours, staring blankly at the cold concrete walls, lost in her thoughts. I tried to stay strong for her, but it wasn't easy. I missed the warmth of the sun, the feel of wind in my hair, and the grass beneath my feet. I missed school, friends, everything about the life we used to have. But every time I brought up the idea of leaving, Dad would snap. "You want to die?" he'd shout, spittle flying from his mouth. "You want the radiation to melt you from the inside? To watch your skin peel off in chunks? Is that what you want?" His anger was frightening, and we learned to keep quiet after that. We became shadows of who we used to be, obedient and scared, just going through the motions of our underground life. As months turned into years, I noticed something else about Dad. His paranoia, already intense, only seemed to grow. He'd spend hours poring over his notebooks, muttering about secret government plots and hidden dangers lurking everywhere. Sometimes, I'd wake in the middle of the night and find him standing over us, staring down at Emily and me as we slept, his face unreadable. Dad became obsessed with conserving what little we had left, tightening the rationing more and more. Our meals shrank to small, barely enough portions that left us always hungry. He said it was necessary, that we had to prepare for the possibility of being stuck down there for decades. But there were things that didn't quite add up. Sometimes, I'd noticed that the labels on our canned food were newer than they should have been, given how long we'd supposedly been in the shelter. And once, I swear I heard traffic noises from above while Dad was in the shower. Sounds that shouldn't have been possible if the world had really been destroyed. A terrible thought began to creep into my mind. What if there never had been a nuclear war? What if Dad had made it all up? The idea was so horrifying that I tried to push it away, but once it took hold, it was impossible to ignore. I started watching Dad more carefully, looking for any slip-ups or signs that could confirm what I was beginning to fear. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late, long after Emily and I should have been asleep. I woke up, thirsty, and was about to get a drink of water when I heard the unmistakable sound of the shelter door opening. I peeked around the corner and saw Dad slipping out into the basement, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quietly crept after him. I reached the shelter door just as it was closing, and I quickly wedged my foot in to keep it from locking. Through the small crack, I could see Dad climbing the stairs leading out of the shelter. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. Then, taking a deep breath, I summoned every bit of courage I had and slowly pushed the door open, following him. The basement was dark and musty, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me. I'd almost forgotten what it looked like after so many years underground. My heart pounded so loud in my ears I was sure Dad could hear it. But I pressed on, creeping up the stairs behind him. At the top of the stairs, I froze. The door to the main house was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could hear muffled sounds. Sounds that shouldn't exist in a world that had supposedly ended. The low hum of a refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog, the soft whisper of wind rustling through trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated. Trembling, I pushed the door open, and what I saw left me breathless. I stepped into the kitchen of my childhood home. Moonlight poured through the windows, casting pale light on a scene that was both painfully familiar and utterly unbelievable. Everything was normal. Clean dishes rested in the rack beside the sink. A calendar on the wall showed the current year, years after we'd supposedly gone into the shelter. There was even a bowl of fresh fruit on the counter. The world hadn't ended. It had gone on without us, completely unaware of the prison we'd been locked in. Suddenly, I heard the sound of the front door opening and closing, and a wave of panic crashed over me. Dad would be back any moment. I had to get back to the shelter. As quietly as I could, I turned and raced down the stairs, slipping back into the basement just in time. I pulled the shelter door shut behind me, hearing Dad's footsteps above, growing closer. I dove into my bunk, my mind spinning from everything I had just seen. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. It was worse than any nuclear apocalypse. Our father had been lying to us for years, keeping us locked in that underground hell for reasons I couldn't even begin to understand. As I lay there in the dark, listening to Dad re-enter the shelter, I knew one thing for certain. Everything had changed. The truth was out there, just beyond that steel door. Somehow, someway, I was going to find a way to get Emily and me back to it. But what I didn't know was that my midnight discovery was just the beginning. The real horrors and the fight for our freedom were still ahead. Sleep wouldn't come that night. I lay awake, my mind racing with the weight of what I had discovered. The world above was still alive, thriving, completely unaware of the nightmare we were living beneath the earth. Every creak and groan of the shelter seemed to taunt me, a constant reminder of the lie we'd been trapped in for so long. When the artificial dawn finally broke in our windowless prison, I watched Dad go through his usual morning routine. He checked the non-existent radiation levels, inspected our dwindling supplies, and prepared our meager breakfast rations. It was all a carefully rehearsed performance, and now I understood. But for what purpose? What kind of man locks his own children away like this and lies to them so completely? I struggled to keep my face neutral, terrified that Dad would somehow sense the change in me. Emily, sweet Emily, remained blissfully unaware. I caught her eyeing the bland, reconstituted eggs on her plate, her face contorting with poorly concealed disgust, and my heart broke. How much of her childhood had been stolen? How much of mine? Jack. Dad's voice was gruff, snapping me out of my thoughts. You're awfully quiet this morning. Everything okay, son? I forced a smile, praying it didn't look as sickly as it felt. Yes, sir. Just tired, I guess. He studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Had I imagined the flicker of suspicion that crossed his face? Well, buck up. We've got a lot to do today. I want to run a full systems check on the air filtration units. The day dragged on, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. I went through the motions of our daily routine, all the while my mind racing, plotting how to get us out of this place. But the harsh truth of our situation was clear. Dad held all the power. He controlled the food, the water, the very air we breathed. And, most crucially, he controlled the door. That night, after Dad had finally fallen asleep, I carefully shook Emily awake. Her eyes, still heavy with sleep, widened in confusion as I pressed a finger to my lips, signaling for her to stay quiet. I led her to the far corner of the shelter, as far away from Dad's bunk as I could manage. Emily? I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. I need to tell you something important, but you have to promise me that you'll stay calm and stay quiet. Okay? She nodded, her face a mix of fear and curiosity. Taking a deep breath, I told her everything. I told her about sneaking out of the shelter, about the untouched world I'd seen above. With every word I spoke, I watched as the color drained from her face, the reality of the situation settling in. But that's impossible. she stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. Dad said, "The radiation, the bombs." "I know what Dad said," I interrupted gently, my voice low. "But he lied to us, Emily. I don't know why, but he's been lying this whole time." Tears welled up in her eyes, and I pulled her into a tight hug, trying to comfort her as best as I could. "What are we going to do?" she sobbed into my shoulder, her tiny body trembling. "We're going to get out of here," I whispered, my own heart in my throat. I tried to sound confident, though inside I felt anything but. "I don't know how yet, but we will. We just need to be patient. We need to wait for the right moment." Little did I know how long that wait would stretch, or how high the cost of our freedom would ultimately climb. The following weeks became a special kind of torture. Every moment felt like walking on a knife's edge. We went through our daily routines, pretending that everything was normal while secretly searching for any opportunity to escape. But Dad was vigilant, almost obsessively so. The shelter door remained locked at all times, and the key was always around his neck, as if it was his lifeline to control everything. Emily had a hard time keeping up the act. I'd often catch her staring longingly at the door or flinching away when Dad touched her. More than once, I had to quickly distract him when I saw her eyes welling up with tears that didn't seem to have a clear reason. As for me, I threw myself into learning everything I could about the shelter systems. I volunteered for every maintenance task I could, memorizing every pipe, wire, and vent. I figured that knowledge would be our best weapon when the time came to act. It was during one of these maintenance sessions that I made a discovery that sent a chill down my spine. We were checking the shelter's outer walls for damage when I noticed something odd. A small section that sounded hollow when I tapped it. Dad quickly ushered me away, claiming it was just a weird quirk in the construction. But I wasn't fooled. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I decided to investigate. I spent hours searching, my hands shaking as I carefully examined the wall. Eventually, I found it, a hidden panel almost seamlessly concealed. My heart was racing as I pried it open. What I found inside was worse than I could have imagined. Stacks of newspapers, their dates stretching back over the years we'd been underground. Printed emails from Dad's work, asking about his extended family emergency leave. But the most damning of all was a small journal, its pages filled with Dad's frantic scribblings. I didn't have time to read it all, but what I saw was enough to confirm my growing dread. Dad had been spiraling into paranoid delusion. His journal spoke of protecting us from a world he saw as utterly corrupt and dangerous. He believed that keeping us locked away in the shelter was the only way to keep us safe, to preserve our purity. As I carefully put everything back in place and resealed the panel, a new, deeper fear gripped me. We weren't just dealing with a liar or a kidnapper. We were trapped in the underground world of a madman. The next morning, Dad introduced a new addition to our already grueling daily routine: decontamination showers. He claimed it was an extra precaution against radiation, but the gleam in his eyes told me something different. He wasn't just worried about radiation anymore. He was tightening his control, adding another layer to his twisted fantasy. The showers were cold, uncomfortable, and, worst of all, violated our sense of privacy. Dad insisted on supervising, making sure we were thorough. His eyes lingered on Emily, and each time I saw it, something dark and furious twisted in my chest. I knew then, more than ever, that we had to escape, and soon. The opportunity we'd been waiting for came when the water filtration system malfunctioned. Dad had to go to his hidden stash of supplies for replacement parts. It was a risk, but it might be our only shot at getting out. "Emily," I whispered urgently as soon as Dad left the room, "do you remember what I showed you about the door mechanism?" She looked at me, her face pale, but there was determination in her eyes. She nodded. "Good. When I give the signal, you need to run to the control panel and punch in the emergency unlock code. Can you do that?" Another nod. "Okay, I'm going to create a distraction. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, don't stop until that door is open. Promise me." "I promise," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear, but steady. Her trust in me was all I had. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I'd never deliberately hurt anyone before, let alone my own father. But as I thought of Emily's haunted eyes, of the years of our lives that had been stolen, I knew I had no choice. I waited, the sound of Dad's footsteps growing louder as he approached. Then, as soon as I heard him near, I set the plan into motion. I yanked hard on one of the water pipes I'd loosened earlier. The pipe burst, spraying water everywhere. I yelled in surprise, just loud enough to draw his attention. Dad came rushing into the room, panic flashing across his face as he saw the flood. While he bent to examine the broken pipe, I seized my chance. I swung the heavy wrench down, the metal connecting with the back of his head. He crumpled to the floor, shock and betrayal written across his face as he lost consciousness. A wave of nausea and guilt threatened to overtake me, but I pushed it down. I had no time for hesitation. Now! Do it now! I shouted to Emily. Without missing a beat, she rushed to the control panel, her small fingers flying over the keys. The sound of locks disengaging rang through the room like music. The door began to swing open. Come on! I grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the exit. Our bare feet slapped against the cold concrete floor as we raced up the stairs, through the kitchen, that surreal, everyday kitchen that had always seemed so normal, and finally, out the front door. The world outside hit us like a punch to the gut. The sun, brighter than we'd remembered, stung our eyes. The wind, carrying familiar smells we had long forgotten, nearly knocked us off our feet. For a long moment, we stood there on the porch, stunned by the sensory overload we'd been deprived of for so long. Then we heard it. A groan from inside the house. Dad was waking up. Panic surged and we took off. Hand in hand, we ran down the street, ignoring the confused stares of neighbors we barely recognized. We ran as if our lives depended on it, our lungs burning and our legs threatening to give out. The sound of footsteps behind us, whether real or imagined, only pushed us to run faster. We didn't stop until we reached a park several blocks away. Collapsing on the grass, we gasped for breath. The adrenaline began to ebb, and the weight of what we'd done, and what we'd just escaped, began to settle over me. We were free, but we were alone, confused, vulnerable. Emily broke down then, her tears finally flowing as the reality of the day hit her. I pulled her close, my own throat tight with emotion. My hand gently stroked her hair as I whispered, "It's okay, we're out, we're safe now." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Dad was out there and I knew he wouldn't give up. He'd come after us no matter what. And beyond him, the world had changed, moved on without us. How would we fit back into a life we barely remembered? How could we explain what had happened to us? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, marking the end of our first day of freedom, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. Our ordeal wasn't over. In many ways, it had just begun. The world we found ourselves in was nothing like the post-apocalyptic wasteland Dad had warned us about. There were no piles of rubble, no radiation-scorched earth, and no bands of desperate survivors. Instead, we stepped into a typical suburban neighborhood, practically unchanged except for the passing of time. The houses were intact, their windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. Neatly trimmed lawns stretched out in front of them, the scent of freshly cut grass almost overwhelming after so many years of recycled air. In the distance, the sounds of everyday life floated through the air, cars humming along the roads, the faint murmur of a television from an open window, and a dog barking at some unseen disturbance. It was unnervingly, terrifyingly normal. As we wandered through the strange yet familiar landscape, the full weight of our father's deception slammed into me. There had been no nuclear war, no worldwide catastrophe, no reason for us to have been locked away all these years. The truth was almost too much to handle. Emily's hand tightened around mine. "Jack," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why would Dad lie to us like that?" I didn't have an answer. The enormity of what he'd done to us was beyond my comprehension. How could a father lock his own children away, stealing their lives? The man I thought I knew seemed to vanish, replaced by a stranger whose motives I couldn't understand. We moved through the neighborhood, jumping at the sight of every passing car, every person we saw in the distance. To them, we must have looked like wild creatures, barefoot, wide-eyed, dressed in the simple, utilitarian clothes we'd worn in the shelter. I caught sight of curtains twitching as curious neighbors peeked out at us more than once. As night began to fall and the temperature dropped, I realized we needed to find shelter. The irony of it wasn't lost on me. After so many years underground, now we were out here, desperately searching for a roof over our heads. "I think I know where we can go," I told Emily, a distant memory pulling at me. "Do you remember Mrs. Callahan? Mom's friend from the hospital?" Emily's brow furrowed as she tried to remember. "The nice lady with the cats?" "That's right," I said, relieved that some of our memories from before still lingered. "She lived just a few blocks from us. If she's still there." It was a long shot, but it was all we had. We walked through the darkening streets, every shadow feeling like it might hide a threat. A few times, I thought I heard footsteps behind us, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Eventually, we reached a small, well-maintained house with a porch light glowing warmly. The nameplate by the door read Callahan, and a spark of hope flared inside me. Taking a deep breath, I rang the doorbell. We waited in silence, the seconds stretching into what felt like forever. I was about to ring again when the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 60s. Her gray hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and her eyes widened in surprise as she saw us. "My God," she whispered. "Jack? Emily? Is that really you?" Before I could even respond, she pulled us inside, enveloping us in a tight hug. The familiar scent of her perfume, the same one she'd worn years ago, filled the air and brought tears to my eyes. "We thought you were dead," Mrs. Callahan said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father told us there had been an accident, that you all had died." As she led us into the living room, wrapped us in blankets, and offered us hot cocoa, the full scope of our father's lies began to unfold. There had been no accident, no tragedy that had taken us away. Just a man slowly losing his mind, dragging his children into the madness with him. Mrs. Callahan listened in shock as we told her about the years we'd spent in the shelter. Her face went pale as we described the decontamination showers and our father's increasingly erratic behavior. "We need to call the police," she said, reaching for her phone. "That man needs to be locked up for what he's done to you." But as she dialed, a cold feeling settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The sense of being watched that had haunted me since our escape grew stronger. And then, with a sudden jolt of terror, I realized what had been bothering me. The house was too quiet. Where were Mrs. Callahan's cats? As though on cue, a floorboard creaked behind us. We turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, backlit by the dim hallway light. My heart stopped as I recognized the silhouette. "Dad?" Emily whispered, shrinking back against me. He stepped into the room, holding something in his hand, the length of pipe I had used to strike him during our escape. His eyes, when they met mine, were cold and empty. "I'm very disappointed in you, Jack," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "I thought I raised you better than this. Didn't I teach you about the dangers of the outside world?" Mrs. Callahan stepped forward, standing between us and Dad, phone still clutched in her hand. "John, what have you done? These children are my children," Dad snarled, all traces of calm vanishing from his voice. "And I'll do whatever it takes to protect them, even from themselves." He moved into the room, the pipe raised menacingly. Mrs. Callahan stood her ground, but I could see her trembling. "Run!" Mrs. Callahan hissed at us. "I'll hold him off. Run!" Everything happened in an instant after that. Dad lunged forward. A sickening thud rang out, and Mrs. Callahan collapsed to the floor. Emily screamed. Then we were running again out the back door and into the night. Behind us, I could hear Dad's heavy footsteps and his voice, once so comforting, now twisted with madness. "Children, come back. It's not safe out there." But we knew the truth now. The only thing not safe was the man we had once called father. As we fled into the darkness, dodging between houses and scaling fences. A new determination filled me. We were free now. We knew the truth. And no matter what it took, I was going to make sure we stayed that way. But freedom, I was quickly realizing, came with its own set of challenges. And the night was far from over. The next few hours were a blur of fear and adrenaline. Emily and I ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they were going to collapse. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hide our father's lurking figure. Somehow, we managed to stay ahead of him. As dawn began to break, we found ourselves in a small park on the outskirts of town. Exhausted and with nowhere else to go, we huddled together on a bench, watching the world wake up around us. People jogged past, dogs barked in the distance, and the smell of fresh coffee wafted from a nearby cafe. It was all so beautifully, painfully normal. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice small and filled with fear. Before I could answer, a police car pulled up beside the park. 2 officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the area before locking onto us. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was what we needed, help from the authorities. As the officers approached, I saw recognition flicker in their eyes. They'd been looking for us. What followed was a blur of activity. We were taken to the police station, where calm, gentle detectives asked us about our time in the shelter. Social workers were called in to help us, and through it all, the search for our father ramped up. They found him 3 days later, holed up in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. He didn't go quietly. In the end, it took a team of negotiators and a SWAT unit to bring him in. The man they arrested was hardly the father we remembered. Wild-eyed and shouting about protecting his children from the corrupted world. He seemed more like a monster than a man. The trial became a media sensation. Our story captivated the nation, sparking debates about mental health, parental rights, and the long-term effects of isolation. Experts were called in to explain our father's descent into paranoid delusion. Some painted him as a victim of his own mind, while others condemned him as a monster. For Emily and me, it was a painful process of reliving our trauma in the public eye. But it was also cathartic. Each testimony, each piece of evidence presented, helped dismantle the false reality our father had built around us. In the end, he was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to life in prison. As they led him away, he glanced at us one last time. "I only wanted to keep you safe," he said, his voice breaking. It was the last time we ever saw him. The years that followed were hard. Emily and I had so much to catch up on. Years of education, social skills, and life experiences that had been stolen from us. We went through intensive therapy, learning how to process the trauma and adapt to life in the real world. It wasn't easy. There were nightmares, panic attacks, and moments when the outside world felt too big, too overwhelming. Simple things that others took for granted, like going to a crowded mall or watching fireworks on the 4th of July, could trigger intense anxiety in us. But slowly, painfully, we started to heal. We learned to trust again and began forming connections with others. We discovered the small freedoms that had been denied to us for so long, the sensation of rain on our skin, the taste of fresh fruit, the simple joy of choosing our own clothes. Emily threw herself into her studies, eager to make up for the time lost. She's in college now, majoring in psychology, focusing on trauma and recovery. She wants to help others who have faced experiences like ours. As for me, I found comfort in writing. At first, putting our story into words was terrifying. But over time, it became a way to release the weight of our past. What you're reading now is part of that journey. Even now, years later, the old fears sometimes still creep in. There are nights when I wake up, disoriented, convinced I'm back in that cold, underground prison. And in those moments, I have to remind myself that it's over, that we're free now. But I still wonder, will we ever really be free? The shelter might have been a physical place, but its grip still lingers in our minds. It's a bunker of memories and trauma that we carry with us. And there are times when, in the dead of night, I find myself checking locks on doors, peering out into the distance for threats that no longer exist. Because the most terrifying truth I've come to understand is this: the real fallout isn't radiation or the end of the world. It's the long-lasting effects of betrayal by someone you should have been able to trust. The lingering echoes of trauma that continue long after the immediate danger has passed. And I worry that part of it will never fade. So, if you're reading this, remember, the most dangerous lies aren't always those told by others. Sometimes, they're the ones we tell ourselves to make us feel safe. Question everything, hold on to your freedom, and never take the simple joys in life for granted. Because you never know when someone might try to take them away.